My name is Evelyn, and I'm 67 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my family sat me at the kids' table. I never thought I'd see the day when my own family, the very people I'd supported and loved for decades, would look at me and decide I didn't belong with them anymore. But that's exactly what happened. A long life of being the dependable one, the responsible one, the one who sacrificed, only to be shoved into a seat meant for toddlers and teenagers, like I was nothing. The humiliation was almost unbearable. I remember walking into my niece's house, the smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filling the air, and hearing the usual clamor of voices. Everyone was already gathered, laughing, pouring drinks, shuffling kids around. I had brought my famous sweet potato casserole, the one everyone always demanded I make. For years, I'd been the one hosting Thanksgiving, but now it had passed to the younger generation, as they called it. I didn't mind. I thought maybe it was my turn to finally relax and let others carry the burden. But when I walked into the dining room, my eyes immediately fell on the seating arrangements. A long, beautifully set table stretched across the room, complete with polished silverware, china plates, and wine glasses. That's where my siblings, nieces, nephews, and their spouses sat. And then off to the side, shoved into the corner near the playpen, was a smaller table. Plastic chairs, paper napkins, cartoon-themed cups for the little ones. And in the middle of those seats was a name card, Evelyn. I froze. At first I thought it must be a mistake. Surely they hadn't actually put me there. But when I picked up the card, my niece Laura came bustling over, smiling wide. "Oh, Aunt Evelyn. Yes, that's your spot, right there with the little ones. We figured you wouldn't mind, it's closer to the kids, and you're always so good with them." Her words dripped with a false sweetness that made my stomach twist. She wasn't asking, she was telling me where I belonged. I glanced back at the main table, where my younger brother and his wife were pouring wine, where my cousins laughed over inside jokes, where my so-called place in the family used to be. And then I looked at the kids' table, two boys already flicking peas at each other, a teenage girl scrolling on her phone, a toddler banging his spoon like a drum. I swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Of course," I said softly. "I don't mind." But I did. I minded more than I could ever admit in that moment. The entire dinner, I sat there listening to the kids argue about video games, trying to stop the little one from spilling cranberry sauce on my blouse. I could hear my siblings clinking glasses at the main table, reminiscing about old family memories, and not once did they turn to include me. I was invisible. At one point, my brother George stood up to give a toast. "To family," he said proudly, raising his glass. "To the generations who came before us, and the generations to come." Everyone cheered, lifting their crystal glasses high. And me? I lifted a plastic cup of apple juice. I felt my face burn with shame. Was this all I was to them now? A babysitter? A placeholder? A body to fill the corner seat? After everything I had done, after paying off my parents' mortgage when they struggled, after helping Laura through college when she couldn't afford tuition, after hosting every holiday for 20 years, I had been reduced to a joke. It wasn't about the seat. It was about respect. Or rather, the lack of it. When dinner ended, I quietly cleared the kids' plates, stacking them neatly, while the rest of the family moved into the living room for dessert and drinks. No one noticed when I slipped out early, casserole dish tucked under my arm. No one called after me. Driving home that night, the headlights blurred through my tears. I wasn't just humiliated. I was angry. Angry that they thought so little of me. Angry that they believed I would swallow the insult without complaint. Angry that in their eyes I had become irrelevant. But as I pulled into my driveway, a thought settled in my chest, slow and deliberate. Maybe I didn't have to stay invisible. Maybe I didn't have to keep giving and giving while they treated me like an afterthought. Because there was one thing my family had never considered. I wasn't just Evelyn, the spinster aunt they could shuffle to the corner. I was Evelyn, the woman who had worked her entire life, who had built a comfortable fortune, who owned property, investments, and heirlooms they all secretly hoped to inherit one day. They thought I'd always be generous. They thought I'd leave everything to them because family sticks together. But family had just shown me exactly where I stood. And that's when I realized If they wanted to treat me like a child, I would treat them like strangers in my will. The kids' table wasn't the first insult, it was just the final straw. Growing up, I was the dependable one. The middle child of 3, sandwiched between my brother George and my younger sister Helen, I was the one who blended into the background. George was the golden boy, the firstborn son who could do no wrong. Helen was the baby, doted on by everyone, excused for every mistake. And me? I was the quiet one, the responsible one. The one no one bragged about, but everyone relied on when things went wrong. When our father fell ill in my 20s, who was the one who skipped vacations and paid for his medications? Me. When George wanted to chase his business dreams, and Helen decided to move across the country for a fresh start, who stayed behind to care for our mother? Me. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't demand attention. I just worked teaching school during the day, tutoring in the evenings, saving every penny I could. By the time I was 40, I had quietly built a nest egg that none of my siblings even knew about. But wealth didn't buy me respect. Not in this family. George built his career in real estate, and even when his company nearly went bankrupt, my parents praised his entrepreneurial spirit. Helen bounced between jobs and marriages, but she was always the free spirit, admired for her independence. Meanwhile, if I so much as bought myself a new dress, I was told I was spoiling myself. It wasn't just my siblings. My nieces and nephews learned to follow suit. Laura, the same niece who sat me at the kids' table, once laughed at me for still living in the house I'd bought decades ago. "Don't you want something bigger, Aunt Evelyn?" she teased. "Everyone else upgrades eventually." I smiled politely then, but inside, I wanted to tell her. I didn't need a bigger house because I wasn't trying to prove anything. I had stability, I had security. Something her parents had never truly given her. And yet, despite all I had done, I was always the one pushed aside. At family gatherings, my voice was drowned out by louder ones. When decisions were made about holidays or reunions, I was the last to know. When gifts were opened on Christmas morning, mine were the ones quickly tossed aside while others received gasps and cheers. I began to notice a pattern. They didn't respect me because I didn't demand their respect. I had made myself small for their sake, and they had taken that as permission to treat me as less than. I still remember the sting of one Christmas years ago, when I handed Laura an envelope with a check to help cover her college tuition. She barely looked at it before saying, "Thanks, Aunt Evelyn," then tossing it into a pile of wrapping paper. Later, I overheard her telling Helen, "Mom, why didn't you just give me more money instead of making Aunt Evelyn step in?" That was the moment I realized even my sacrifices were invisible. And yet, I kept making them. When George's business failed, I quietly loaned him money to get back on his feet. He promised to repay me, but he never did. When Helen's second marriage collapsed, I let her stay in my guest room for nearly a year, covering her bills until she could stand again. She never thanked me, only complained about how cramped my house was. It became a cycle. I gave. They took. And no one ever stopped to ask how I was doing, or what I needed. But the worst part wasn't the money or the sacrifices. It was the way they saw me. To them, I wasn't Evelyn. The woman who had built a career, who had financial security, who had traveled the world in her later years, who had lived life on her own terms. No. To them, I was Aunt Evelyn, the spinster aunt, the woman with no real family of her own, the convenient afterthought. At first, I accepted it. I told myself it was just my role. But the older I got, the harder it became to ignore. Especially when I overheard things they thought I couldn't hear. Like the time George said to Helen, "Well, when Evelyn's gone, at least we'll get something out of it." Or the time Laura told her husband, "Don't worry, Aunt Evelyn doesn't spend much. She'll leave us something big one day." I never confronted them. I never said a word. But I remembered. Every little dismissal, every cutting comment, every assumption that my only worth was what I would leave behind. And so, when I sat at the kids' table last Thanksgiving, it wasn't just about the plastic cup or the paper napkin. It was about every single moment in my life where I had been treated as less than. That was the moment everything crystallized. They thought I would always be there to clean up after them, to write the checks, to sit quietly in the corner and smile while they took center stage. They thought my inheritance was already theirs, as though I owed it to them for existing. But they were wrong. I might have been the quiet one, the dependable one, the invisible one. But I still had power. And I still had the right to decide how my story would end. And that's when I realized I had been giving all my life. It was finally time to take something back. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, but that year, it became my breaking point. The day had started like any other holiday. I woke up early, showered, and took extra care with my appearance. I wore a new burgundy blouse I had bought just for the occasion, paired with my best slacks and pearl earrings. My sweet potato casserole baked in the oven, its familiar scent filling my small kitchen. As I drove to my niece Laura's house, I told myself to keep an open heart. Yes, my family had a way of dismissing me. Yes, they took me for granted, but maybe this year would be different. Maybe I was being too sensitive, too focused on the past, but deep down, I knew better. Laura's house buzzed with noise and warmth when I arrived. Children ran through the halls, squealing with excitement. The adults gathered in clusters, chatting and laughing. The table in the dining room stretched long and elegant, set with fine china, silverware, and candles glowing in crystal holders. It was a sight worthy of a magazine. And then my eyes caught it, the smaller table shoved into the corner near the playpen. Covered in a cheap plastic cloth patterned with cartoon turkeys, it had mismatched plastic chairs and paper napkins folded sloppily beside each plate. And there, among name cards scrawled in crayon for Ellie, Tommy, and Kayla, was one more, Evelyn. For a moment my chest tightened. Surely this was a mistake. Surely someone had put my name there as a joke. But as I stood frozen, casserole dish in hand, Laura rushed over with her bright, practiced smile. "Aunt Evelyn, perfect, you brought your casserole, just set it in the kitchen, and your spot's right over there," she pointed, not at the elegant dining table where my siblings and their spouses were settling in, but at the kids' corner. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. Everyone was watching. George raised his glass, already chatting with Laura's husband. Helen laughed loudly at some joke from her son-in-law. No one seemed to notice the look on my face, the humiliation burning in my cheeks, so I smiled. I set my casserole down and quietly walked to the kids' table. The plastic chair squeaked as I Saturday, a teenage girl barely looked up from her phone. Two little boys immediately began arguing over who got the bigger spoon. A toddler next to me banged his sippy cup against the table, splashing juice onto my blouse. Meanwhile, across the room, the adults clinked their wine glasses, their laughter ringing out like music from another world. I tried to join in. Tried to catch George's eye. Tried to add a comment to their conversation. But my voice was drowned out by the chaos of the kids around me. No one looked my way. No one noticed I was missing from the real table. At one point, George stood up, raising his glass high. "To family," he declared. "To the generations that came before us and the generations to come." Everyone at the main table cheered, raising their crystal glasses filled with wine. And me? I raised a plastic cup of apple juice. The sound of laughter filled the room as if sealing me out. I wasn't part of them anymore. I wasn't one of the adults, the respected elders. I was just an afterthought. Dinner passed in a blur. I spoon-fed mashed potatoes to the toddler, cleaned up spilled milk, and listened to the teenagers complain about Wi-Fi speeds. Across the room, my family exchanged memories, toasts, and stories I wasn't invited to share. When dessert was served, Laura carried a pumpkin pie to the main table, announcing proudly, "This is my grandmother's recipe." Everyone applauded as if she had baked it herself. Not one word was said about my casserole even, though half the dish was gone. The final blow came when Helen leaned over from the main table, laughing. "Isn't Evelyn just perfect with the kids? Maybe we should put her there every year." Everyone chuckled. Everyone except me. I laughed along, a brittle sound that barely escaped my throat. But inside, something snapped. I had been disrespected before. I had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as invisible. But never had I been so openly humiliated. Never had my place in the family been made so clear. I wasn't one of them. I was just a babysitter with a bloodline. When the meal ended, I quietly cleared the children's plates, stacking them neatly in the kitchen while the rest of the family moved into the living room for dessert and drinks. No one noticed when I slipped on my coat and picked up my empty casserole dish. No one called after me when I walked out the door. Driving home in the dark, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Tears blurred my vision, but underneath the sorrow was something else, something sharp, something steady. Anger. Not the kind of fleeting anger that fades with time, but the deep, simmering kind that carves itself into your bones. They thought they could treat me like a child. They thought I would take it quietly, just as I had taken every insult before. They thought my silence meant I was powerless, but they had forgotten one thing. I wasn't just Evelyn, the woman they shoved to the kids' table. I was Evelyn, the woman who had spent decades working, saving, and building a legacy they all assumed would one day be theirs. They had been counting on my generosity. They had already carved up my future in their minds, believing I owed them everything simply because we shared blood. But now I knew exactly how little they valued me. And that night, I made a silent promise. If they wanted to treat me like a child, I would treat them like beggars when it came time to divide my will. They thought they were entitled to everything I owned, but they had no idea what that meant. After the humiliation of Thanksgiving, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept hearing Helen's laughter, George's toast, the scrape of the plastic chair against the floor. My chest burned with the memory. But amid the anger, another thought took root. My family's disrespect wasn't just about a seat at the table, it was about how they had always seen me. As background, as support, as someone who existed to give, not to be honored. And yet, the irony was this. In the end, they all expected to profit from me. Over the years, I had built something they barely knew about. I had lived modestly, yes. I didn't buy flashy cars or upgrade my house every 5 years like George. I didn't rack up debt with failed marriages like Helen. Instead, I worked. I saved. I invested quietly. I lived below my means. And it paid off. I had my little 3-bedroom house. Bought outright decades ago. I had retirement accounts and investments that had grown steadily with time. I had jewelry, antiques, and heirlooms pieces from my parents and grandparents. Things my nieces had already eyed with casual remarks like, "One day, this will be mine." If only they knew the truth. When I sat down with my financial records the morning after Thanksgiving, even I was startled by the total. Over $1.2 million in assets. Between my house, savings, stocks, and personal property, I wasn't just comfortable. I was wealthy, at least by my family's standards. And I knew exactly what they assumed would happen when I passed. George thought he would inherit the house. I'd overheard him say as much to his son years ago. Helen assumed she'd get the jewelry. She had even asked me once, "Which pieces are you leaving me, Evie? The sapphire brooch would go so well with my evening dress." Laura and the other nieces and nephews joked openly about who would snag what. As though I was a store shelf waiting for them to pick me clean. None of them ever considered that I might have my own plans. None of them asked what I wanted, or how I envisioned my legacy. They just assumed. And that assumption was the root of their disrespect. Because when you think someone owes you something, you stop valuing them as a person. Sitting at my desk, I pulled out an old manila folder labeled Will and Estate Planning. It had been years since I last looked at it. Back then, I'd written it in the simplest way. Everything split evenly between George, Helen, and their children. It seemed fair at the time. It seemed practical. But fairness didn't mean anything anymore. Not when they had shown me just how little they cared. My hand trembled as I flipped through the documents. I had the power to change it all. To redirect everything I had worked for. To decide exactly who would benefit from my life's work and who would not. For the first time in years, I smiled. I thought about the people outside my family who had treated me with respect. My neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, who always shoveled my sidewalk before I could get to it. My former students, some of whom still sent me Christmas cards decades later, thanking me for the impact I had on their lives. The charities I had supported quietly for years, scholarships for underprivileged kids, food banks, women's shelters. They had shown me more gratitude than my own blood ever had. And then I thought of my mother. She used to say, "Legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's what you leave in people." What was I leaving in my family? Entitlement. Arrogance. Greed. No. That wouldn't be my legacy. Not anymore. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, but also more determined. They had humiliated me by putting me at the kids' table. They had dismissed me, ignored me, treated me like a placeholder. But the one place they couldn't push me aside was in the matter of my will. That was mine. That was my voice. My final say. And, oh, how sweet it would be to use it. I imagined the look on George's face when he realized the house he'd been counting on was going elsewhere. I pictured Helen's horror when she learned she was at the bottom of the list, with nothing but scraps left behind. I thought of Laura, the proud hostess, realizing all her little jokes about my fortune had backfired spectacularly. The thought warmed me more than any Thanksgiving toast ever could. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about correcting decades of imbalance, about making sure my legacy meant something more than entitlement. That night, I placed the folder back in my desk drawer, but this time with a different resolve. The will would change. The question was no longer if, it was how. And so, with a spark of satisfaction, I picked up the phone and made an appointment with my lawyer. The kids' table was bad enough, but what happened next erased any doubt in my mind. A week after Thanksgiving, I told myself I was over it. I tried to bury the memory of sitting in that plastic chair with juice spilled down my blouse while my siblings toasted family with crystal glasses. I told myself it was just a seating mistake, a thoughtless choice, not worth the energy of carrying anger. But deep down, the bitterness lingered like a thorn under my skin. And then Christmas came. Laura was hosting again, and against my better judgment, I went. I told myself it was for the sake of tradition, that maybe they would make it right this time. Maybe someone had realized how hurtful it had been. Maybe this time, I would be included. But the moment I stepped into the house, I knew I'd been foolish to hope. The main table was already set, shining with holiday colors. And there, in the corner, once again, was the kids' table, this time decorated with paper snowflakes and plastic cups with reindeer faces. And yes, right in the middle, end of it was my name card, Evelyn. I froze in the doorway. My heart thudded in my chest, a mix of humiliation and rage. Surely, after last time, they wouldn't repeat this. Surely, someone would notice, would correct it. But no one did. Helen breezed by me with a plate of appetizers. "Oh good, you're here. The kids will be thrilled to have you with them again. You always keep them entertained." Entertained. That's all I was to her. George barely looked up from pouring himself a drink. "Evening, Evie. Don't forget to grab one of Laura's party hats. We're all wearing them for dinner." His hat was already perched on his head, jaunty and ridiculous. I stood there, casserole dish in hand, my cheeks burning, my throat tight. They hadn't even considered me for the main table. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. I forced a smile, set my dish down, and quietly took my place at the corner table, again. But the humiliation didn't stop there. When the meal began, the adults launched into a conversation about inheritance. George joked loudly about how, one day, this house will be ours. "Laura, just wait until Aunt Evelyn kicks the bucket." The room erupted in laughter. Even Helen chuckled, adding, "I just hope she remembers I've always had my eye on Mom's brooch." "You can't take everything, George," Laura smirked. "Oh, please. You all know Evelyn's sitting on a fortune. She doesn't spend a dime. She's probably got millions tucked away, just waiting for us. Honestly, it's the only reason we let her bring that casserole every year." The laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears. I sat frozen, my fork poised in midair, my chest aching. They weren't just disrespecting me, they were mocking me. Reducing my entire life, my sacrifices, my hard work, to a punchline about their future payday. Not one of them thought to lower their voices, to hide their greed. They spoke openly, comfortably, because in their minds, my inheritance was already theirs. My life was nothing more than a waiting game. I blinked back tears, forcing myself to chew, to swallow, to smile faintly at the children next to me so they wouldn't see my pain. But inside, I burned. I thought of the years I had spent caring for our parents when George and Helen had been too busy. I thought of the money I had given to help Laura through college, the nights I stayed up tutoring her in math, the endless sacrifices I had made without complaint. And here they were, laughing at me, treating me like a placeholder in their lives. That was the moment the thorn of bitterness drove deeper. The humiliation of Thanksgiving had been bad enough, but this was worse. It wasn't just dismissal, it was exploitation. I realized then that my family had never respected me, not truly. They tolerated me because of what they thought they would gain. They dismissed me in life and salivated over my death. And I knew, with crystal clarity, that I couldn't let them win. When dessert came, I quietly slipped out again. No one noticed. No one cared. At home, I sat at my desk with the manila folder containing my will. My hands no longer trembled. My decision was made. If they wanted to treat me like I was invisible in life, then they would be invisible in my legacy. And so, the very next morning, I picked up the phone and scheduled an appointment with my lawyer. Walking into that law office, I felt more powerful than I had in years. The morning after Christmas, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. The sting of humiliation was still there, but beneath it burned a new determination. My family thought they could treat me as an afterthought, a joke, a walking inheritance waiting to die. But they were wrong. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't voiceless. My will was my weapon, and I intended to use it. I called the office of Mr. Jacobs, the attorney I'd used years ago when I first drafted my estate plan. The receptionist told me he had retired, but a younger partner, Miss Clara Benson, had taken over his clients. Something about her name struck me as sharp and professional, exactly what I needed. I booked the first appointment she had available. 2 days later, I walked into her office. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room with polished wood tables and leather chairs. When Clara entered, she was younger than I expected, late 30s, maybe, but her handshake was firm, and her eyes were clear and focused. "Mrs. Whitfield?" she asked. "Yes, Evelyn, please," I replied, straightening in my chair. She smiled. "Evelyn, then. I've reviewed your old file. It looks like your will hasn't been updated in nearly 15 years. Tell me what's on your mind." I took a deep breath. My family humiliated me. They've disrespected me for years, but this holiday season made me realize just how little they value me. They think my money is theirs. They think my home, my jewelry, my savings, it all belongs to them by default. And I want to make sure they know, when the time comes, that it doesn't. Clara leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. "So you'd like to revise your will? Can you tell me how your estate is currently structured?" "It's simple," I said bitterly. Everything was to be divided evenly between my siblings, George and Helen, and their children. "And now?" Clara asked. "Now?" I said firmly. "I want them at the bottom. I want them to get as little as legally possible. Enough that they can't contest it, but not enough to feel satisfied. The bulk of my estate will go elsewhere." Clara's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't judge. She only nodded. "That's absolutely doable. Before we discuss new beneficiaries, let's review your assets to get a sense of what we're working with." I pulled a folder from my bag, neatly organized, with bank statements, investment summaries, and property documents. Clara flipped through them quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the numbers. "You've done very well for yourself," she said. "Between your home, retirement accounts, and investments, you're looking at roughly $1.2 million. More, depending on market growth." I nodded. "And they've all been circling me like vultures, assuming it would be theirs, but I want it used for something better." "Do you have anyone in mind?" Clara asked. I thought of Mrs. Lopez, my neighbor who always brought me soup when I was sick. I thought of the scholarship funds I had contributed to over the years. I thought of my old students, the letters I'd saved in a box. Thank you for believing in me, Mrs. Whitfield. You changed my life. Yes, I said slowly. Charities. Scholarships for kids who can't afford college. Women's shelters. And I want a portion to go to people who have actually shown me kindness, friends, neighbors. Not my greedy siblings. Clara smiled faintly. I admire that. We can structure it so your siblings receive only a token amount, perhaps a few $1,000s each. Just enough to make it clear they weren't forgotten, which makes it harder for them to contest the will. Meanwhile, the bulk will go where you truly want it to. My heart lifted for the first time in weeks. Yes, that's exactly what I want. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the framework. Clara asked careful questions, ensuring every detail was airtight. She explained how to set up charitable trusts, how to allocate specific bequests, and how to word the document so there would be no loopholes for George or Helen to exploit. At one point, Clara looked up from her notes and asked, "Would you like to include a statement of intent, something personal? It's not legally binding, but sometimes it helps explain your choices." The idea made me pause. Did I want them to know why? Did I want them to hear my voice one last time, even if only through paper? Yes, I said finally. I want them to know exactly why they're at the bottom. I want them to understand that respect matters more than blood. Clara nodded. Then we'll draft a letter to be read alongside the will. Sometimes words can cut deeper than numbers. For the first time in years, I felt like I had power. Like I wasn't the invisible ant shuffled to the kids' table, but a woman with a voice, with choices, with the ability to shape how I would be remembered. When I left Clara's office that afternoon, the winter air felt crisp against my skin. I pulled my coat tighter, a small smile tugging at my lips. For once, I wasn't just reacting to my family's cruelty. I was acting. They thought they had me figured out. They thought my silence meant weakness, but they had no idea what was coming. And as I walked out of that office, I knew this. The next time my family thought of me, it would not be with laughter, it would be with shock. As I signed the papers, I felt like I was rewriting not just my will but my story. The next week, I sat across from Clara in her office again. A neat stack of papers lay on the table, bound together with a binder clip. It was everything we had discussed. The breakdown of my estate, the charitable trusts, the token amounts for my siblings. I picked up the pen she offered me, and for a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted my decision, but because of the weight of it. This wasn't just about numbers and signatures. This was about sending a message that would echo long after I was gone. Then, with a steady hand, I signed. Clara watched me with calm professionalism. Congratulations, Evelyn. Your estate plan is now updated and legally airtight. When the time comes, your wishes will be honored exactly as you've written them. I exhaled slowly, a strange mixture of relief and satisfaction washing over me. For years, I had allowed my family to diminish me, to treat me as though I were irrelevant. But here, in these pages, my voice was permanent. My truth was carved into law. Clara slid a second folder toward me. This is the statement of intent you asked me to prepare. You can edit it however you like, but I've included a version that explains your reasoning. I opened it, my eyes scanning the words. To my family, I leave this message. You may wonder why you find yourselves at the bottom of my will. The answer is simple. Respect is worth more than inheritance. For years, I gave and gave, but what I received in return was dismissal, entitlement, and greed. I want you to understand that wealth is not guaranteed by blood, it must be earned through love, gratitude, and respect. Since that was not shown to me, I have chosen to leave my legacy to those who value kindness and resilience. May this serve as a lesson. How you treat people matters more than what you expect from them. My throat tightened as I read it. It was everything I had ever wanted to say but never dared to voice aloud. I'll sign this too, I told Clara. When the meeting ended, I left the office with both folders tucked securely into my bag. The cold air nipped at my cheeks, but I didn't feel chilled. I felt alive, powerful. The next step was secrecy. No one could know, not yet. If my siblings or nieces caught wind of what I had done, they'd badger me, guilt me, or worse, try to manipulate me into changing it. So I played the part they expected. At the next Sunday brunch, I smiled politely as George bragged about his new car, bought with money he couldn't afford. I nodded along as Helen complained about her tight finances, hinting at how much easier life would be once she got her share of my estate. Laura joked again about keeping Aunt Evelyn happy so she doesn't cut us out. Everyone laughed, assuming it was all in good fun. I laughed too. Oh, if only they knew. The truth was folded neatly into my desk drawer at home, locked away in a fireproof box. And every time I walked past that drawer, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. My secret weapon, my silent revenge. It wasn't just about punishing them. It was about reclaiming my dignity. For once, I wasn't the one at the mercy of their dismissive remarks. They were at the mercy of my decisions, and they didn't even know it. At night, I found myself imagining the day the will would be read. I pictured their faces when Clara announced that George was getting a mere $5,000 out of $1 million estate. I imagined Helen's gasp when she learned the jewelry she coveted so openly would be auctioned to fund scholarships. I could practically hear Laura's indignation when she discovered she wasn't inheriting the house, but that it would become a community center for after-school tutoring. The thought made me smile in the dark, my heart lighter than it had been in years. But secrecy had its weight too. I had to be careful not to slip. When George asked casually one afternoon, "You've still got that old will, right, Evie? The one that splits everything evenly?" I only smiled and said, "Oh, I haven't looked at it in years." He nodded, satisfied. He had no idea. Helen was more direct. "Evie, you know Mom's jewelry belongs with me, right? It just wouldn't feel right if it ended up anywhere else." I tilted my head, pretending to think. "I suppose we'll just have to see what happens, won't we?" She laughed, assuming I was teasing. If only she knew how close to the truth I was. Meanwhile, I kept busy refining the details. I met with Clara again to establish a small scholarship fund in my name, ensuring that even before my death, part of my legacy would begin. I contacted a women's shelter and set up an anonymous donation, just to feel the joy of giving without strings attached. Each act of planning, each step of secrecy, felt like stitching together a new story for myself. For once, I wasn't defined by what my family thought of me. I was defined by my own choices. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they found out. Would they rage? Would they cry? Would they finally see me for who I was, not who they imagined me to be? That thought didn't scare me, it thrilled me. And little did I know, rumors would soon start spreading that I was changing my will and my family would come knocking for answers. The more I stayed quiet, the bolder their assumptions became. After signing my new will, I thought I could finally rest. My secret was safe in Clara's office, and in the fireproof box tucked neatly in my study. I carried on with life as though nothing had changed. Outwardly, I was the same, Evelyn, polite, reserved, agreeable. But inside, I felt lighter, powerful, vindicated. It amazed me how quickly my family revealed their true colors once I stopped reacting. At brunch one Sunday, George leaned back in his chair, sipping his third mimosa, and said, "Once Evelyn's gone, we'll finally have the funds to pay off the mortgage. Won't that be nice, darling?" He grinned at his wife, who smiled dreamily, as though my money was already sitting in her bank account. I nearly choked on my tea, but I forced a small smile. "Well, I hope you're not planning on me leaving too soon," George chuckled. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way, Evie. We just mean you've been so responsible all your life. You'll be leaving a nice cushion for the family. It's only natural." Natural. That word tasted bitter. Natural to them that my entire life's work should become their safety net. Natural that I should sacrifice so they could live easier lives. But I said nothing. I let him believe what he wanted. And oh, how satisfying it was to know the truth. Helen was no better. One afternoon, she came by with coffee and a forced smile. "Evie," she said, setting the cup in front of me, "I was thinking, when the time comes, Maybe you should leave me Mom's sapphire brooch. I mean, it really wouldn't look right on anyone else, and you know I've always loved it. I sipped my coffee calmly. I'll keep that in mind, I said. Her eyes lit up, assuming she had secured her prize. I almost laughed. That brooch, along with the rest of my jewelry, was already earmarked to be sold at auction for scholarships. The image of her face when she found out made me smile into my cup. Laura, bold as ever, took things a step further. At dinner one evening, she announced in front of the entire family, "When Aunt Evelyn passes, we'll have to decide what to do with her house. I'm thinking of turning it into an Airbnb. It'd make a fortune. What do you think?" The table erupted in laughter and excited chatter. George said it was a great investment idea. Helen chimed in about how she'd take the antique furniture to redecorate her own living room. Not one of them looked at me as they spoke, as if I were already gone, as if my opinion didn't matter. I sat there, nibbling at my salad, a calm smile plastered on my face. Inside, though, I was blazing with satisfaction. Let them dream. Let them carve up my estate in their greedy little imaginations. The reality waiting for them would be far sweeter for me. But my silence must have unsettled them. Because soon their assumptions turned into probing questions. "Evie," George said one afternoon, "you've still got that old will, right? The one Jacobs helped you with years ago?" I shrugged. "I haven't looked at it in a long time." "Good," he said with a relieved smile. "Wouldn't want any surprises." Helen tried her own approach. "You know, Evie, some people make rash changes near the end of their lives. But that wouldn't be you. You've always been steady, dependable." I smiled faintly. "Steady doesn't mean predictable." Her brow furrowed, but she quickly covered it with a laugh. Laura, usually so brazen, pulled me aside after dinner one night. "You know, Aunt Evelyn," she said softly, "I hope you realize how much we all count on you. We've built our lives with the thought that you'd be there for us in the future. It would be devastating if that weren't the case." The threat in her words was thinly veiled, but I only patted her arm. "Don't worry, Laura, you'll get what's coming to you." She smiled, reassured. I smiled too, but for very different reasons. As the weeks passed, I found myself enjoying their assumptions more than I expected. It was like watching a play where I already knew the ending, a private comedy staged just for me. Their greed, their entitlement, their arrogance, it no longer hurt me. It only amused me. But amusement is a dangerous thing. Because as I laughed silently at their expense, rumors began to swirl. One evening, Mrs. Lopez stopped me at the mailbox. "Evelyn, I saw you heading into that law office downtown the other day. Everything all right?" I froze, then forced a casual smile. "Oh, just some paperwork, nothing important." But her words lingered. If she had noticed, others might have too. And if word spread that I had been to see a lawyer, my family's suspicions would grow sharper. I had to tread carefully. Because as much as I relished the thought of their shock, I wasn't ready for them to start digging. Not yet. And sure enough, the very next week, my family cornered me and demanded answers. It started with whispers, then turned into accusations. By February, the air between me and my family had shifted. They didn't know it yet, but they could feel it like animals sensing a storm on the horizon. My silence had unsettled them. My calm smiles and cryptic answers left them guessing. And nothing makes greedy people more restless than uncertainty. It began with small comments. George, ever the blunt one, called me one evening. "Evie," he said, his voice too casual. "I heard you've been downtown a lot lately. Some of the guys at the club saw you going into that law office. You changing something we should know about?" I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. "Just some paperwork, George. Don't worry yourself." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Well, you know how rumors start. Folks talk. Just wanted to make sure everything's the same. You wouldn't want to stir things up." "Of course not," I replied. "You'll get what's coming to you." He hung up, sounding satisfied. If only he knew. Then came Helen. She visited under the guise of checking in, but her eyes roamed my living room like a hawk. "Evie," she said sweetly. "You've always been so generous. I hope you know we count on you. You haven't done anything drastic, have you?" I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Drastic? Oh, she said, waving her hand vaguely. "Changing things, rearranging. You wouldn't do that, not after all these years." I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make her lean in too. "Helen, let me put your mind at ease. You're definitely still in my will." Her shoulders relaxed, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Good. I knew you wouldn't forget family." I smiled back, hiding my amusement. Of course, she was still in it, just not where she thought. But the whispers didn't stop there. By spring, even Laura was growing bold. She cornered me after a family dinner, her expression sharp. "Aunt Evelyn, everyone's talking. They say you've been meeting with lawyers. Are you changing things?" I raised an eyebrow. "And if I were?" Her eyes narrowed. "That wouldn't be fair. We've been here for you all these years. We've cared for you. Included you." I almost laughed out loud. "Included me? At the kids' table?" I bit my tongue and let her continue. "And it would be cruel to just cut us out. You wouldn't do that, would you?" I placed a hand on her arm and said softly, "Laura, darling, don't worry. You'll be remembered." She relaxed, mistaking reassurance for truth. But the fire in her eyes told me she wasn't fully convinced. That was when I realized the rumors had grown legs. Someone had seen me at Clara's office, maybe Mrs. Lopez, maybe another passerby, and mentioned it. My family had sniffed it out like blood in the water, and greedy people never let go of a scent. Soon, their concern escalated into subtle threats. George called again, his voice heavy. "Evie, sometimes families fall apart over wills, ugly stuff, lawsuits, estrangement. I'd hate for that to happen to us. Best to keep things simple, don't you think?" Helen chimed in a few days later. "Evie, you've always been steady, but I've heard stories lawyers convincing people to make changes they regret. Don't let anyone take advantage of you. You know what's right." Even Laura, bold as ever, left me a voicemail that made my stomach clench. "Aunt Evelyn, if you're changing things, we deserve to know. It's our future too. Don't make me find out the hard way." Their words didn't scare me, they fueled me. Each veiled threat, each desperate plea, each arrogant assumption confirmed what I already knew. They didn't love me. They loved what they thought they'd get from me. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. While they schemed, I was living quietly, content with the knowledge that my estate was already secured. My scholarships were set, my charities were named, my neighbors, my students, the people who had truly valued me, they would inherit my gratitude. My family would inherit nothing but the consequences of their greed. Still, I played my part. I nodded at brunch, laughed at their jokes, even let Helen prattle on about how she'd redecorate her living room with Mom's heirloom china. I let them believe the future was theirs. And all the while, my silence gnawed at them. One evening, George lost his temper. We were at Laura's again, and after a few drinks he slammed his glass down on the table. "Enough of this secrecy, Evie. Did you change your will or not?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to me. Helen looked nervous, Laura looked furious, and George looked ready to explode. I folded my hands calmly and smiled. "George, don't be silly. You're family. Of course you're in my will." His shoulders relaxed. Helen sighed in relief. Laura smirked. And I smiled too, because every word I'd spoken was true, just not the way they thought. But even as they breathed their sighs of relief, I knew the storm was coming, and when it broke, they'd never recover. I didn't plan to reveal anything that night, but the words slipped out sharper than I intended. It was Easter Sunday when Laura hosted another family dinner. I nearly didn't go. The thought of sitting through another evening of veiled comments and greedy assumptions made my stomach churn. But a small, mischievous part of me wanted to be there, wanted to see how much their paranoia had grown. I arrived with my lemon bars, smiling politely as George kissed my cheek and Helen hugged me too tightly, both of them a little too eager. I could see it in their eyes, the calculation, the nervousness. They were desperate for reassurance. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Ham and scalloped potatoes, wine flowing, chatter bouncing around the room. But it didn't take long before the conversation turned. It always did. "So, Evelyn," George began, swirling his wine, "have you been keeping up with the stock market? I imagine your portfolio's looking pretty strong these days." Helen chimed in with a laugh. "Oh, George, she won't tell you. Evelyn's always been so secretive with her money. But we all know she's sitting on a fortune." Laura leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Speaking of fortunes, Aunt Evelyn, you never did answer me last time. Are you planning to keep the house in the family, or—" She trailed off, waiting for me to fill the silence. I set down my fork and looked around the table. Their expectant faces stared back, George's smug confidence, Helen's nervous smile, Laura's hungry stare. For once, I didn't bother to mask my amusement. "Oh, don't worry," I said softly. "You'll all get exactly what you deserve." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. George chuckled, trying to brush it off. "See? That's Evelyn, always dramatic." But Helen's smile faltered. Laura narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean by that?" she pressed. I took a slow sip of my water before answering. "I mean what I said. When the time comes, you'll get what you've earned. Nothing more, nothing less." The silence was thick now. Even the children at the smaller table seemed to sense the tension. George forced a laugh again. "She's joking." Of course she's joking. But I wasn't, and the look in my eyes told them so. Dinner carried on awkwardly after that. They tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but the damage was done. Every time I lifted my glass or smiled to myself, I could feel their eyes on me, wondering, worrying. Later, when dessert was served, Laura cornered me in the kitchen. Her voice was low, sharp. "Aunt Evelyn, if you're changing your will, I deserve to know. Don't play games with us." I set down the serving knife and met her gaze evenly. "Laura, I'm not playing games. I'm telling the truth. You'll get what's coming to you." Her face flushed, anger and fear battling behind her eyes. "You wouldn't dare cut us out." I smiled faintly. "Wouldn't I?" She opened her mouth to argue, but George called her back to the table. She left, but not before shooting me a look that could have cut glass. That night, as I drove home, I replayed the scene over and over. I hadn't meant to be so direct, but I couldn't help it. The arrogance, the entitlement, it had been too much. They deserved to squirm. And squirm they would. In the days that followed, I could sense the shift. George called me more often, his voice syrupy sweet, offering to take me to lunch or run errands for me. Helen began dropping by with little gifts, flowers, pastries. A scarf, she said, reminded her of me. Even Laura softened her tone, inviting me to family outings she'd never included me in before. It would have been touching, if I didn't know the truth. If I didn't know it was all born of fear. I played along, smiling, accepting their gestures, thanking them warmly. All the while, my secret sat safe in Clara's office, waiting. One evening, Helen asked me outright, "Evie, you haven't really made changes, have you? All this talk is just to keep us guessing?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. "Helen, let me put it this way. If you treated me better while I was alive, maybe you wouldn't be so worried about what happens after I'm gone." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She didn't know what to say, and that was the point. I had no intention of soothing their fears. Not anymore. They had made me invisible at the table, mocked me behind my back, laughed about my death like it was a party they couldn't wait for. Now I was the one holding the power. And I intended to savor every moment of it. But what I didn't realize then was that my words had lit a fuse, and soon, their desperation would explode into chaos. Even from the grave, I finally had the last word. The day of the will reading came sooner than my family expected. My passing wasn't sudden. I'd been slowing down for a while, but when it finally happened, I left quietly. with no fanfare. Just me, alone in my bed, a faint smile on my lips. Because I knew what was coming. I could picture it even then. George puffing up, with confidence. Helen wringing her hands in greedy anticipation. Laura pretending to be sad while calculating her future gains. They thought they were about to cash in on decades of my life. But what they got instead was justice. The law office was packed the day Clara summoned them. My siblings, their children, their spouses all dressed in black, all putting on the performance of grieving family members. But beneath the solemn faces, I knew there was eagerness. They couldn't hide it. Clara entered the room with calm professionalism, a neat stack of papers in her hands. She greeted them politely, then cleared her throat. "We're here today to read the last will and testament of Evelyn Whitfield." She began with the formalities, reading the legal language that outlined my estate. My family shifted in their seats, barely listening. They wanted the numbers, they wanted the breakdown, and then Clara reached the part they had been waiting for. "To my brother George," she read, "I leave the sum of $5,000. George blinked, certain he had misheard. "What?" he blurted. Clara didn't pause. "To my sister Helen, I also leave the sum of $5,000. Helen gasped, clutching her chest. "This must be a mistake," Clara continued, unfazed. "To my niece Laura I leave $1, with the hope that it serves as a reminder. Respect is worth more than inheritance." Laura shot to her feet, her face red with fury. $1? She shouted. "This is a joke! Tell me this is a joke!" But Clara was not finished. She turned a page and read the next section. "To the rest of my family, who assumed my wealth was theirs by right, I leave this message. You will receive nothing more than what I have allotted. For years, I was dismissed, humiliated, and treated as an afterthought. You laughed at me, mocked me, and reduced my worth to what you expected to gain when I was gone. I want you to understand that wealth is not guaranteed by blood. It must be earned through love, gratitude, and respect. Since that was not shown to me, I have chosen to leave my legacy elsewhere." The room was silent, save for the sound of my words echoing in their ears. Then Clara read on. "To the women's shelter in our community, I leave my jewelry collection and antiques, to be auctioned to fund safe housing and support programs. To the local scholarship fund, I leave half of my financial assets, to provide opportunities for students who cannot afford higher education. To the community center, I leave my home, to be converted into a tutoring and mentorship space for children. And to my neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, who showed me more kindness than my own blood, I leave the remaining half of my financial assets, with gratitude." Gasps filled the room. George's face turned purple. Helen burst into tears. Laura sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Clara closed the folder. "That concludes the reading of the will." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then George slammed his fist on the table. "This is outrageous. She can't do this." Clara met his glare calmly. "She could, and she did. The will is legally binding. Your sister was of sound mind when she signed it. If you choose to contest, you'll be throwing away more money than you'll ever gain." Helen sobbed into a handkerchief. $5,000? After everything I did for her? Laura sneered. "This isn't over. She can't just—" She caught herself, then lowered her voice. "She's not even here to defend herself." My voice, written in ink, still filled the room, and nothing they could say or do would change it. George stormed out first, muttering curses under his breath. Helen followed, weeping. Laura lingered, glaring at Clara as if she could will the words to change. But eventually, she too left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara remained behind with Mrs. Lopez, who sat quietly in the corner, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "She really did this?" Mrs. Lopez whispered. Clara nodded. "She did. She wanted you to know how much your kindness meant to her." Mrs. Lopez pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. "Oh, Evelyn. Thank you." And just like that, my legacy was sealed. Not in the greedy hands of those who mocked me, but in the lives of those who would carry forward something better. But while my true heirs celebrated, my family's rage was only beginning and the fallout would tear them apart. My words were meant to sting, but I never imagined how quickly they'd destroy them. The news of my will spread through the family like wildfire. By the time they left Clara's office, George was cursing under his breath, Helen was sobbing uncontrollably, and Laura was seething with a fury that made her look decades older. The car ride home was tense, with George gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Helen wept in the passenger seat, muttering, "How could she do this to us? After everything we did for her?" Laura sat in the back, silent at first, until her rage boiled over. "She hated us," Laura spat. "That's the only explanation. She hated us. And she waited until she was gone to stick the knife in." George growled. "She didn't hate us. She lost her mind. She must have been manipulated by that lawyer, or those charities. This isn't her. Evelyn wouldn't do this to family." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. That night, the calls began. George phoned Helen, ranting about how they needed to fight this in court. Helen, through her tears, reminded him that Clara had said contesting the will would be a waste of money. "She made sure of it, George. She covered every loophole," Laura interrupted, her voice sharp. "You're both missing the point. She humiliated us, publicly. Do you realize how this looks? Everyone will think we drove her away, that we didn't care about her. She's made us look like monsters." "Maybe because we were," Helen whispered, her voice cracking. Silence followed. The next weeks were chaos. George and Helen turned on each other almost immediately. George accused Helen of poisoning Evelyn against him. Helen accused George of always taking more than his share. Their arguments grew vicious. At one point, George shouted, "If you hadn't been so greedy about Mom's jewelry, maybe Evelyn wouldn't have snapped." Helen fired back. "Greedy? You were planning to sell her house before she was even cold in the ground." Their words sliced deeper than they realized, reopening wounds that had festered for years. Laura, meanwhile, distanced herself from both of them. She told friends and co-workers that she had no idea Evelyn would cut them out, painting herself as the victim of an ungrateful aunt. But whispers spread quickly. People remembered the jokes Laura had made about inheriting Evelyn's house. They remembered her smug comments at dinner tables. The sympathy she expected never came. Instead, her reputation soured. At work, colleagues began treating her with pity, but not the kind she wanted. "Must be tough," one coworker said. "Thinking you'd get everything, only to be left with nothing." Laura burned with humiliation. The $1 she had inherited became a running joke among her peers. Some even taped a dollar bill to her office door. For George, the financial blow was crushing. He had been counting on my estate to bail him out of his debts. Without it, creditors circled, threatening to seize his assets. His fancy car was repossessed within months. His wife, tired of the stress, left him. Helen fared no better. She had been hoping to use her share to finally stabilize her life, to secure a comfortable retirement. Instead, she was left clinging to her modest pension, bitter and resentful. She told anyone who would listen that I had been brainwashed by outsiders. But the truth was written in my own words, and no one believed her excuses. The family gatherings stopped altogether. No more Easter dinners, no more Christmas celebrations. The fracture was permanent. Meanwhile, the community thrived. The scholarships I funded sent dozens of students to college, many of them first-generation graduates. The women's shelter expanded, offering more beds and resources than ever before. My home became a tutoring center, filled with the laughter of children and the quiet determination of mentors guiding them. Newspaper articles celebrated the transformation. My name became associated not with bitterness but with generosity. "Local teacher leaves legacy of kindness," one headline read. And every time George, Helen, or Laura saw those stories, the bitterness deepened. Because they knew the truth. I had chosen strangers over them, and the world agreed with me. George tried one last time to rally the family, suggesting they pool their meager inheritances to hire a lawyer. But Helen refused, too exhausted from years of disappointment. Laura sneered at the idea, saying, "I won't waste another dime chasing after her money." She won. And that was the truth. I had won. The family I once longed to please had destroyed itself in the wake of my choices. They had exposed their greed, their entitlement, their ugliness for all to see. And though I wasn't there to watch it unfold, I knew it happened exactly as I had planned. But while my family tore itself apart, the people I truly loved began carrying my legacy forward, and that was the sweetest victory of all. While my family sulked in bitterness, others bloomed because of what I left behind. The newspapers called it the Whitfield gift. For weeks after my will was executed, stories circulated about the unexpected beneficiaries of my estate. Neighbors, charities, and community leaders were stunned and grateful. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. At the women's shelter, the jewelry auction drew in more money than anyone had anticipated. Reporters photographed my sapphire brooch and pearl necklace before they were sold, noting how they carried a history of resilience and sacrifice. The auction raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough to fund new programs, hire more staff, and expand their housing capacity. One young mother, speaking at a press conference, held her toddler on her hip and said through tears, "I don't know Mrs. Whitfield. But because of her, my son and I have a safe place to sleep. She may be gone, but her kindness saved us." The scholarship fund blossomed too. Dozens of students who thought college was out of reach suddenly found doors opening. Among them was a boy named Marcus, the son of a single mother I had once taught in my classroom years ago. He wrote a letter to the local paper. "Mrs. Whitfield believed in my mom when no one else did. Now, she's helping me too, even though she's gone. I'll carry her lessons with me always." The tutoring center, once my modest home, became a hub of activity. Volunteers painted the walls bright colors, filled the rooms with books and computers, and hung a plaque at the entrance. The Evelyn Whitfield Learning Center. Children poured through the doors after school, their laughter echoing through the halls that had once been so quiet. Neighbors who once waved politely now spoke of me with reverence. "She was always so kind, so quiet," Mrs. Lopez said in an interview. "We never knew how much she was planning for all of us. Evelyn didn't just live here, she left something that will last forever." Mrs. Lopez herself was stunned when she received her portion of my estate. She had expected nothing. Her kindness toward me had never been for gain. But with the money I left her, she paid off her mortgage, helped her grandchildren with college tuition, and donated a portion back to the very community center that bore my name. "She gave me more than I could have dreamed," she said, tears in her eyes. "I'll honor her by giving back." The ripple effects spread far beyond what even I had imagined. Newspapers picked up the story. Social media buzzed with admiration. People called me an unsung hero, a woman who had chosen legacy over greed. And in the middle of all this, my family fumed. George couldn't bear to read the papers, but his wife clipped every article, muttering bitterly about how Evelyn could have saved us but chose strangers instead. Helen avoided the grocery store, too ashamed to face neighbors who whispered about her fall from grace. And Laura, once so smug, was now the butt of jokes, the niece who inherited a single dollar. While they withered in resentment, the heirs they had dismissed, the ones they never considered, were thriving. Children from low-income families graduated high school with hope for the future. Women fleeing abuse rebuilt their lives in safe apartments. Young students studied in my old living room, their pencils scratching over math problems at the same kitchen table where I once ate alone. I had always dreamed of being remembered for more than casseroles and quiet sacrifices. And now I was. It wasn't about the money. It was about meaning. My family had wanted wealth for themselves, but I had turned that wealth into opportunity for others. Even years later, my name lingered in the community. Students who graduated with my scholarships sent thank you letters to the center, addressed to me even though I was gone. Volunteers at the shelter spoke of me as if they knew me personally. And Mrs. Lopez, standing outside the learning center one spring, told a local reporter, "She may have left us quietly, but Evelyn's voice is louder now than it ever was in life." The irony was rich. My family had dismissed me, silenced me, pushed me to the kids' table, but in the end, I spoke louder than all of them combined. And as my true heirs carried my legacy forward, my family, once united in greed, finally turned on each other completely. In the end, my voice mattered more in death than it ever did in life. The months after my will was read became a dividing line in my family's history. Everything before was marked by entitlement and assumption. Everything after by bitterness and blame. They had always assumed I would be their safety net, their quiet provider, the background figure who gave without question. But when the truth was revealed, their foundation cracked. George, once proud and boastful, was reduced to desperation. His debts consumed him, and the reputation he had built at his country club evaporated. Friends who once envied him now whispered behind his back, mocking how he had been outsmarted by the quiet sister. His pride stung worse than his financial ruin, though both cut him deeply. Helen became a shadow of herself. She replayed every conversation we'd had in her mind, searching for a clue, a warning, something she could have changed. But what haunted her most were her own words, the flippant comments, the entitled demands, the laughter at my expense. She had thought they were harmless. Now, they echoed like condemnation. Laura suffered a different fate. The single dollar I left her became infamous. Coworkers teased her relentlessly, and friends pulled away, seeing her as selfish and greedy. She told anyone who would listen that I had betrayed her, but the world didn't see it that way. To them, I was the woman who had uplifted a community, while she was the niece who had treated me like a burden. They had wanted my wealth. Instead, they inherited shame. Meanwhile, my true heirs built something lasting. The Evelyn Whitfield Learning Center became a beacon in the neighborhood, a place where children who had been dismissed and overlooked just as I had been found support and encouragement. Every time a child raised their hand in class, every time a student crossed a stage to accept a diploma, my legacy lived on. The scholarships bore my name too. When recipients wrote essays about what the award meant to them, they spoke of hope, of opportunity, of gratitude. They didn't know me, but they honored me. The women's shelter grew as well, transforming lives one family at a time. Women who had fled abuse found new beginnings there, thanks to the jewelry my sister once coveted. Each bracelet, each necklace, each heirloom carried not just beauty but purpose. I had always been dismissed by my own blood, but in giving to strangers, I became unforgettable. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. Because true legacy isn't about who shares your last name, it's about who carries your values forward. George, Helen, and Laura had none of my values. They had shown me only entitlement. But Mrs. Lopez, the students, the shelter they carried forward, gratitude, kindness, and resilience. My legacy wasn't money. It was the lesson that respect matters more than inheritance. I had wondered, before I left this world, whether my family would ever understand. Whether they would ever look in the mirror and see the truth of who they had been to me. Perhaps, in time, they would. Or perhaps they would stay bitter until their last days. That part was no longer mine to control. What I could control, I had. And in the quiet of eternity, I smiled. Because I had not been erased. I had not been silenced. I had not been shoved permanently to the kids' table. I had taken back my seat. From now on, when people spoke my name, it would not be in hushed tones of pity or mockery. It would be in stories of scholarships earned, shelters expanded, children educated. It would be in the laughter of students learning in my old living room, in the joy of women starting over with dignity, in the gratitude of neighbors who remembered kindness. I had always been invisible to my family. But now, I was unforgettable to the world. And that was the kind of justice no inheritance could buy. They put me at the kids' table, but I put them at the bottom of my will, and in doing so, I rose to the head of my own table, forever.